In the heart of a kingdom shrouded by mist and legend lived a young man named Alaric. Alanric wasn't born into nobility. His origins were humble, a commoner born to a family of weavers. But his heart harbored dreams far grander than his station. From the time he could walk, he'd gazed at the towering castle on the hill, imagining himself within its high walls. Seeing his fascination, the troop leader, a man with twinkling eyes and a jester's motley garb, took Alaric under his wing, where he could hear the queen playing her harp late at night. His days were filled with performances. Once, while the king was boasting of his prowess, Alaric quipped, "Careful, your majesty, or you'll blow a gasket." The king laughed, slapping Alaric on the back. But the queen, ever demure, just smiled and shook her head. Alaric didn't disappoint. Alaric became the king's favorite, always at his side during hunts or tournaments. But something troubled him. He saw the queen rarely. The king, torn between his duties and his family, struggled to find a balance. Alaric, ever observant, noticed the king's distress and devised a plan. Her door was almost always closed. The only sounds escaping were muffled sobs. The importance of seeing beyond one's station in life. When Alaric put on a funny voice and made animal faces, the prince would erupt into giggles. "We need someone to look after the prince while Her Majesty recovers. Who better than our dear Alaric? He's part of the family now." The king placed a hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry about the prince, Alaric. I believe he's ready." With the king's gift, he bought a farm in a village nestled between rolling hills. Each day he woke to the rooster's crow. He missed the grandeur of the castle. Who knows what treasures of history you might stumble upon just around the bend? Sweet dreams. One day, a familiar face appeared at his gate. It was the prince, now a young man. Painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Alaric sat on his porch, sipping cider. The prince was right. But in his motley garb and bells, he concealed a surprising complexity. He navigated a world of kings and queens, venting the frustrations and anxieties that plagued everyone from peasants to royalty, reminding us that beneath our titles and stations, we're all human, prone to laughter, tears, and the sweet pangs of nostalgia. "What a time to be alive," he murmured, and the twilight seemed to whisper back in agreement. "Alaric," he said, "I came to say thank you. You taught me well. I won't forget you." The king initially resisted the idea, but Alaric assured him, "Don't worry, your majesty. I won't let anything happen to the prince, I promise." Over time, the king relaxed, trusting Alaric with the little boy. In the end, it wasn't about the crown or the glory. It was about the connections he'd made, the lives he'd touched. He knew his time in the castle was drawing to a close. As the king approached, his face grave, Alaric knew what it meant. The king summoned Alaric to his study. And sometimes the greatest joys are found not in the grand halls of power, but in the quiet contentment of a simple life well lived. "It's time, Alaric," he said, handing him a hefty pouch. "Here, take this money. Buy yourself a farm. Live out the rest of your days in peace." They'd put on shows, and the royal hall would echo with their laughter. But Alaric always reminded the prince, "Remember, it's just a game. Don't let it affect your judgment." The council agreed, and so Alaric became the prince's nurse. He juggled, he cracked jokes. She's just a child. He became irritable, canceling feasts and keeping late hours. Then one day, the unthinkable happened. The queen went into labor. The king paced anxiously outside the delivery room. But when the royal midwife came out, her face pale and drawn, Alaric felt a chill. "Is everything all right?" the king asked, his voice tight. At the coronation, standing behind the throne, watching the people cheer for their new king, he felt a swell of pride. "I'm sorry, your majesty," the midwife whispered. "The child, it's a boy. But the queen, she's very weak." The king rushed into the room, leading Alaric outside, his face ashen. can't bear the thought of losing her mother. Alaric's heart sank. The queen was expecting a baby. Alaric, unable to bear the suspense, slipped into the queen's room. There they were, the king cradling a tiny baby wrapped in a blanket, while the queen lay still, her breathing shallow. The king looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "You shouldn't be here, Alaric," he said, his voice cracking. "But you were right, I am a fool. I kept calling myself lucky to have an heir. What use is a crown if it brings only misery?" She smiled, and in that moment, Alaric knew he wanted to make her laugh for the rest of his life. Kneeling beside the queen, he felt her hand move. The king and Alaric smiled, grateful for the distraction. Maybe now things would turn around. The art of juggling, the timing of a good gag, the subtle jest that made the nobles squirm. When he turned 18, his mentor gifted him a motley, a traditional jester's outfit of motley hues, a peaked cap, and a wooden staff. "You've got a good head on your shoulders. I want you at my court." With a heart full of gratitude and ambition, Alaric set off to conquer the world. Heart hammering in his chest, Alaric stepped into the courtyard. The sight before him was like a scene from a storybook: knights in shining armor, ladies in flowing gowns, and at the center, a throne-like chair awaiting the birthday boy. And then he saw her, the most beautiful woman Alaric had ever seen. She wore a gown of sky blue, a sapphire necklace around her neck that matched her eyes. As she entered, everyone stood up. The lord bowed deeply. The king turned to Alaric, a smile on his face. "So you're the new jester? Show us what you got." At the end of the performance, the king beckoned to Alaric. One day, overcome with curiosity and worry, Alaric crept near the door and eavesdropped. A lady inside spoke in a low voice. Hours stretched into a day, and still the king didn't emerge. Days turned into weeks, and thankfully, the queen regained her strength, but still, the baby needed a mother's care. He spoke to the king's council, a group of nobles advising the king. It wasn't easy. Alaric doted on the prince, singing him songs, telling him stories. Years flew by in a flurry of royal duties and raising the young prince. Alaric watched over them both, his loyalty unwavering. When the prince grew older, he would join Alaric in his jesting, mimicking lords and ladies. And when the time came for the prince to take the throne, Alaric knew his role had come full circle. Yet there was a tinge of sadness, too. Alaric hesitated, torn between duty and the desire for a simple life. But what about the prince? Who will teach him? And so Alaric left the castle. Yet there was peace here, too. Alaric beamed, his heart full. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the medieval jester might seem like a relic of the past, a quaint figure from history books and Christmas pageants. As we ponder the enduring legacy of the medieval jester, let us remember that laughter echoes through the ages. So until next time, my fellow night owls, keep listening closely to the echoes of the past. All the king's horses, all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Ever since I heard that song as a kid, I've wondered just how high up Humpty Dumpty was sitting before his fall. Was it atop a castle wall? Jesters, fools, clowns, comedians, satirists, whatever you want to call them. They're a constant fixture of medieval life, usually employed by kings, queens, nobles, and popes. They are the butt of everyone's jokes, this time from the famous Book of Hours of the Virgin and the famous Ter's Riches Heirs. The artist of the former, Simon Marmion, was a contemporary of the early Renaissance painter Piero della Francesca. Marmion's background is mostly unknown, but he may have spent time in Italy. Where he picked up an interest in classical antiquity, he would have seen that the jester was staging a comeback. The answer, as is so often the case, is Italy. While the origins of the jester are obscure, the evolution of his costume is not. Like most medieval garments, the jester's motley developed gradually over several centuries, taking on new styles and colors as fashions changed. a word that originally carried the definition of a country bumpkin, someone inexperienced in the ways of the city. Soon enough, this definition expanded to include anyone who acted like a rube. Today, we use the word fool to refer to anyone lacking in intelligence. But in the Middle Ages, foolish people weren't necessarily unintelligent. They were simply unaware of how they were coming across. This lack of self-awareness is precisely what set the jester apart from everyone else at court. He was the only person who could speak his mind without fear of consequence. The jester was free to be offensive because he was already considered a nobody. It's hard to imagine a more quintessentially medieval concept. In a society obsessed with hierarchy and status, the jester was literally beneath the feet of the greatest lords and ladies. He was the lowest of the low. But because of his low status, he was also the highest of the high, free to say anything he wanted without fear of reprisal. The basic elements remained the same. Bells, motley, a dagger, a cap with dangly bits, and sometimes a pouch. The hood or cap with ears was added during the 13th or 14th century, though exactly why remains a mystery. It has been suggested that the dangling bells and ear ornaments signify the jester's freedom from the shackles of decorum, allowing him to mock those around him. This idea fits well with the jester's role as a social outsider, but there's no evidence to support it. Another explanation is that the jester's costume was inspired by that of Saint Francis of Assisi, who was famous for his habit of preaching to birds and animals. Many writers have pointed out the similarities between the jester's outfit and Francis's own simple habit. But there is no connection between the two men other than the fact that they both wore baggy pants and oddly shaped hats. The buffoonish figure was gone, a term that refers to a patchwork garment consisting of leftover scraps of fabric. When they were being sewn together to form the jester's costume, these scraps probably ended up in landfills, a fate that befell most medieval clothing. In the 15th and 16th centuries, however, fashion changed and people began wearing clothes made entirely of brightly colored velvet. So rather than throwing away old garments, tailors began chopping them up and using them as accents on otherwise plain clothing. This technique became especially fashionable among the Italian nobility and soon spread across Europe. Motley thus went from being the outfit of impoverished jesters to a symbol of aristocratic taste, replaced by a jester who looks remarkably similar to the one in Latour's Riches Heirs du Duc de Berry. Look at the posture, the graceful arc of the body, the sweet smile. It's clear that artists considered this new jester a classier sort, and for good reason. By the 1540s, European monarchs were beginning to adopt the Italian Renaissance ideal of the courtly fool, exemplified by the famous characters of Shakespeare's plays. He is believed to have painted this miniature depicting a jester dancing before King Charles VII and his court, inspired by Roman mosaics that showed similar scenes. These comparisons suggest that the jester may have been seen as part of the long classical tradition of courtly entertainment. Notice that this jester isn't wearing bells or a hood, but he is holding a flower, which may indicate something about his character, but without whom the aristocrats wouldn't know what to do with themselves. As soon as the merry monarch takes the throne, the jester disappears from paintings and other works of art. His place is taken by the buffoon, a stockier, uglier figure clad in motley. He's often shown performing acrobatic feats and making a complete fool of himself. The buffoon is basically a jester crossed with an idiot. He's loud and gross and embarrassing. It's hard to imagine him telling witty jokes or subtle puns. In fact, he's almost entirely devoid of intelligence, which explains why he remained popular during the reigns of Elizabeth I and James I. No subtlety required. Even so, it's amazing to think that such an iconic medieval figure has left almost no trace in the historical record, who was famous for his portraits of Henry VIII's court. This particular work, known as the ambassadors, shows two men and an array of bizarre objects. If you look closely at the jester, you'll notice that he's upside down and distorted, as if looking through a funhouse mirror. This effect is a type of anamorphosis made famous by Holbein, in which an image appears distorted unless viewed from a particular angle. This makes the jester even more grotesque, enhancing his comic effect. The ambassadors date from around 1533, the same year that Henry VIII had the first of his 3 wives beheaded. Maybe the jester's pessimism wasn't misplaced after all. Almost everything we think we know about jesters comes from fiction. Shakespeare, Chaucer, and the anonymous authors of medieval romance and fabliaux. We have little insight into the real lives of these men and women whose colorful costumes and loud personalities made them such compelling entertainers. Maybe a church spire or perhaps the roof of the palace itself. But who could blame him if he wanted a better view? And it's hard to imagine medieval art without the jester. The earliest surviving depiction of a jester dates back only to 1394, just over 60 years before Shakespeare was born. Before that, however, a recent study of a 12th century French manuscript known as the Cantigas de Santa Maria has identified 2 figures who appear to be dressed as jesters. If nothing else, this shows that fools were common enough in the 12th century that an artist would know how to draw them. The 1394 artwork is a miniature from the Tours Riches Heirs du Duc de Berry, a lavishly illustrated book of hours created for the French aristocrat Jean, Duke of Berry. This manuscript is one of the most famous books of the Middle Ages and contains over 200 miniatures, more than twice as many as the more famous Book of Kells. 3 of these show a jester, all 3 from different seasons. In summer, the jester wears a flower crown. In autumn, he's carrying a blazing torch. In winter, he's stirring a pot over a fire. And if you notice, his shoes aren't jingling. Unlike later jesters, the one in the Tours Riches Heirs is neither a clown nor a musician. He's a hunter. The fact that he appears in a seasonal cycle suggests that the artist thought of him as a kind of spirit of the season, a tricksy fairy who takes on the characteristics of each month. After all, nobody pays the jester any attention until he falls down and breaks his crown, or maybe that's just a saying. What does it matter? Nobody listens to jesters anyway. You could say they're the original TikTokers. Amusing, disposable, and ultimately destined to get canceled. The question is, can they make a comeback? Let's find out. This channel presents Royal Fools, a history of the jester. To learn about jesters, we must look through the lens of the works of art that feature them. A few decades later, a jester appears in another famous miniature, but the treatment of jesters in art changes completely during the reign of Henry VIII. Perfect example of this type of buffoon is one featured in a painting by Hans Holbein the Younger. But if Henry had looked at a painting from the 1540s, so when did jesters become so witty? When we meet the trickster in literature, he's often wearing motley. The other main component of the jester's costume was his motley, literally a motley ass. The jester was often compared to a fool. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to help support this channel, please consider becoming a patron. Thanks for watching. Just outside the bustling city of London, hidden away among ancient trees and aged stone, lies the Tower of London. This historic fortress has seen its share of intrigue, conflict, and tragedy. But today, we are not concerned with its imposing structure or its turbulent past. Instead, our focus is on the overlooked corners where laughter echoed and jesters played. Even within the rigid hierarchy of the medieval court, there existed a space for merriment and mirth. Here, the constant hum of activity was occasionally punctuated by the jester's bell, signaling the entrance of the court fool. Welcome back to our channel. It's important to remember that the core of their profession was to make people laugh. To achieve this end, they employed a variety of techniques. Some favored wordplay, puns, and humorous riddles, incorporating elements of popular culture into his performances. We'll discuss how the romantic image of the jester differed from the harsh realities of his existence, the perks and privileges he enjoyed, and the precarious balance he had to strike in his interactions with the court. So stay tuned and join us in the next chapter as we continue our exploration of the multifaceted world of the medieval jester. This fusion of high and low, of wit and bawdiness, elevated his status beyond that of a mere entertainer. He became a cultural icon, reflecting the tastes and sensibilities of the people. By embracing the unconventional, the jester carved out a unique space for himself in medieval society. He was the jester, the court fool, the entertainer, the satirist, the rebel, the chronicler, the storyteller, and the poet. All of these roles combined to form a fascinating and complex picture of a medieval jester, a figure who was integral to the social fabric of the time, shaping and being shaped by the society in which he lived. Others excelled in physical comedy, utilizing exaggerated gestures and playful jabs with their staff or other props. Some even specialized in mimicking the foibles and mannerisms of the nobility. What do you find most fascinating about the life of a medieval jester? And do you know any other interesting facts about them? Share your thoughts and any additional information you have in the comments below. Your insights help us create more engaging content for you. Also, if you're enjoying our videos, don't forget to show your support. It means the world to us and helps us keep bringing history to life for you. Thanks for watching and joining us on this journey through time. Until next time, keep exploring the past and stay curious, offering a humorous commentary on their audience. But ultimately, the jester's success depended on their versatility. The more varied his abilities, the better his chance of tickling the royal funny bone and thus securing his place in the good graces of the court. Join us as we bring history to life through captivating storytelling and educational entertainment. During the medieval era, literacy was a rare commodity, and the jester, often the only entertainer with access to books, became the purveyor of tales and rhymes. His stock included witty retorts, topical jests, and clever epithets, serving as a constant source of amusement and social commentary. In a time when written language was confined to the privileged few, the jester kept the flame of storytelling alive, weaving tales that captivated nobles and commoners alike. His improvisational skills allowed him to tailor his performances to the audience, making every gathering a unique event filled with laughter and light-hearted repartee. Rather, he was a multifaceted performer whose skill set was as varied as his attire. While the nobility reveled in their privilege and the clergy aspired to sanctity, the jester stood apart from societal norms. His motley clothes, jingling bells, and painted face signified his unique position, granting him certain privileges while simultaneously setting him apart from the rest of society. This allowed him a freedom of speech and action that others did not possess. He could satirize the powerful and mock the elite without fear of reprisal, becoming the voice of the masses who could not speak their minds freely. In a hierarchical society, the jester was a refreshing breath of irreverence, reminding everyone that not all things were to be taken seriously. A typical jester would have been a competent viol or pipe player, accompanying their songs and stories with lively music. Dancing and miming were also key elements in their performances, and they often incorporated sleight of hand and other simple tricks into their routines. In addition to their musical and performance talents, the jester was expected to be a keen observer of human nature, ready with a witty remark or a satirical jest at any given moment. Their social intelligence allowed them to entertain and amuse the court while also satirizing contemporary issues and personalities in a way that was both clever and subtle. In fact, their ability to hold their own in the verbal sparring matches of the court was a crucial aspect of their job security. And today we journey into the Tower of London to uncover the hidden lives of the medieval jesters. Among the imposing walls of the Tower of London, life was not solely dictated by the grim march of duty and protocol. Theirs was a role as old as civilization itself, a profession predating the modern concept of entertainment. A jester's life revolved around making others laugh, distracting them from the weight of their responsibilities with clever repartee and humorous antics. Their domain spanned everything from the royal court to the streets of bustling towns, adapting to different audiences with a repertoire of songs, jokes, and acrobatic feats. They were the court's resident comedians, skilled in mimicry and slapstick, whose presence was a welcome distraction from the drudgery of medieval life. The medieval jester was not merely a jester, but despite the colorful picture we might paint of the jester as a musician, dancer, acrobat, and poet, yet amidst this multitude of talents required of the jester, it was his silver tongue that was the most essential tool in his trade. And this brings us to the heart of the jester's appeal in medieval society, his status as an outsider. In a time when the boundaries between high and low culture were strictly enforced, the jester defied convention. He sang bawdy songs and told ribald jokes. In the following chapters, we'll peel back the layers of the jester's profession, exploring the realities of life as a medieval jester. Now I want to hear from you. The image of the court jester has echoed through history as a figure of fascination, a harlequin of motley garb whose playful antics concealed a surprisingly keen intellect, forever at the mercy of their patrons' moods and whims. These complex figures, at once central to the royal court and utterly marginalized, their paradoxical existence continues to intrigue us. The jester's clothing is a powerful symbol of their vulnerability and subordination within the social structure of the royal court, to tackle subjects and truths that would otherwise be ignored or silenced. Jesters held a unique position in the royal court, one that allowed them to say things that would make other courtiers tremble. A tightrope walk between making the king laugh and avoiding the executioner's block. We begin to understand the multifaceted nature of their existence. Click here to see the messed up origins of popular board games, or click here to watch. Why was the dildo invented 15,000 years before the wheel? They were entertainers, yes, but also astute observers of human nature, skilled performers, and often unsung heroes of social change. Their laughter may have echoed through the halls of power, but their impact resonated far beyond the realm of amusement. The court jester remains an enduring figure in our collective imagination, a symbol of wit, wisdom, and the courage to speak truth to power. The pressure to constantly perform and please the monarch was immense, and the consequences of failure were dire. This precarious situation forced jesters to develop a keen understanding of the king's mood, personality, and sensitivities. They had to become experts in reading the subtle signs of royal favor and disfavor, knowing at all times how far they could push the boundaries of acceptable jesting without crossing the line into dangerous territory. Moreover, jesters had to contend with the envy of the nobility. The king, as elite advisors and nobles, often saw the jester as direct access to the monarch as a threat to their own influence. They jealously guarded their status and power, and were not hesitant to use it to undermine the jester's position. In this environment, jesters had to navigate a minefield of courtly politics, carefully avoiding any missteps that might anger the nobles or the king. To survive in this high-stakes environment, jesters developed a remarkable resilience. They had to be quick learners, adept at reading the room, and able to adapt their humor to changing circumstances. A successful jester was not just funny, but also intelligent, observant, and street smart. They understood the dynamics of power, knew how to read people, and could anticipate reactions. The survival of the court jester was a testament to their adaptability and resourcefulness. They thrived in an environment where missteps could be costly, where laughter could turn to anger and where the line between popularity and disgrace was razor thin. They acted as social critics, often targeting the hypocrisy, corruption, and abuses of power that plagued the nobility and even the monarchy itself. This was made possible by the very nature of their role as entertainers. As jesters were seen as harmless clowns, their biting comments and satirical jabs went relatively unnoticed or dismissed as just another of their silly antics. However, this perception was deceptive as jesters wielded their wit like a double-edged sword. They used clever wordplay, puns, jokes, and even insults to expose the flaws and follies of those in power. One of the most effective tools in a jester's arsenal was their ability to make light of serious issues, to find the humor in injustice or impropriety. By doing so, they drew attention to problems that might have otherwise been ignored or swept under the rug. For example, a jester might poke fun at a lord for amassing too much wealth or a lady for her extravagant and wasteful lifestyle. While these jabs might have been delivered with a smile, they carried a message that was anything but frivolous. Jesters also played a crucial role in exposing the darker side of courtly life, including the prevalence of sycophancy and backstabbing. They were uniquely positioned to observe the maneuvering and scheming that went on behind closed doors, and they were not afraid to ridicule those who engaged in such behavior. Jesters created a space for dissent and encouraged others to question the status quo. But as we peel back the layers of this iconic role, reflecting back both the good and the bad, while they entertained and amused, they also critiqued and challenged, reminding everyone, including the most powerful, that no one was above scrutiny. We encounter a multifaceted reality that challenges our perceptions of power, privilege, and the human condition. A jester who failed to amuse or who overstepped the bounds of propriety could quickly fall from grace. The 16th century English gesture an instantly recognizable element of their persona that simultaneously signals their social standing and their subordination. The jester's garments, often a motley mix of vibrant colors and playful patterns, are not merely a fashion statement. They are a visual shorthand signifying the wearer's lowly status. Jesters' clothing frequently features bells, further emphasizing their role as entertainers meant to attract attention and amuse their audience. This deliberate marginalization is a key aspect of understanding the jester's position. By donning these distinctive and somewhat demeaning garments, their outfits serve as a constant reminder of where they stand in the hierarchy of the court. Furthermore, the jester's costume often includes a hood that obscures their face, literally hiding their identity behind a veil of absurdity. This practice not only reinforces their comedic persona, a jester may be well known within the royal court, but their name and personal story are often lost to the character they embody. This anonymity is particularly poignant considering that many jesters came from marginalized communities, such as those with physical disabilities or from the lower social classes, a visual representation of their separation from the more privileged members of society. Will Sommers learned this lesson the hard way when he dared to criticize King Henry VII's marriage to Anne Boleyn. His boldness in this matter led to his banishment from court. The incident serves as a stark reminder of the jester's ultimately powerless position. No matter how beloved they were, still mere entertainers easily discarded when they no longer served their purpose. This expendability was compounded by the fact that many jesters came from marginalized backgrounds. They were often individuals with physical deformities, mental disabilities, or simply those from the lowest rungs of society. For these outcasts, the role of court jester was one of the few paths to a measure of security and status. Yet this security was always tenuous, contingent on their ability to constantly amuse and perform. A dwarf jester in the court of Queen Henrietta Maria in the 17th century epitomizes the cruelty and capriciousness that could characterize a jester's life. Hudson, who stood just 18 inches tall, was presented to the queen as a gift hidden, inside a large pie from which he emerged to the delight and amusement of the court. For years, Hudson served as a loyal companion to the Queen, accompanying her on trips and even fighting in the English Civil War. Yet, when he fell out of favor later in life, Hudson was cast aside, dying in poverty and obscurity. His tale is a poignant reminder of the jester's ultimate lack of agency. No matter how beloved or successful they were, still at the whim of the court, mere playthings to be discarded when the novelty wore off. These quirky characters walked a tightrope between amusement and offense, forever dependent on the whims and fancies of their royal masters. The life of a court jester was a paradoxical one, simultaneously privileged and vulnerable, celebrated and scorned. On one hand, they enjoyed a rare freedom of speech and access to the highest echelons of power. With their clever wordplay and cunning gesticulations, they could speak truth to authority in ways no other courtier dared. A well-timed quip from a shrewd jester could influence a king's decision or sway the court as opinion. Take, for instance, the renowned French jester Triboulet, who served under both Kings Louis X, XII, and Francis I in the early 16th century. Tribulations was known for his sharp tongue and audacious witticism, often brazenly mocking the nobility and even the monarch himself. Once when King Francis threatened to execute Tribulations for his impudence, the jester cleverly retorted, "Ah, but you wouldn't execute me without first giving me time to regret having offended you." The king, amused by Tribal's quick thinking, granted him a stay of execution. In this way, the jester's juste wit served as both a weapon and a shield, allowing him to challenge authority while also protecting himself from its wrath. Yet for all their influence and fame, jesters led a precarious existence. It is this fundamental tension between influence and impotence. Despite their colorful appearance and seemingly carefree demeanor, the power of the court jester lay primarily in their ability to speak the unspeakable. In essence, the power of the court jester lay in their ability to hold a mirror up to the court. The survival of the court jester depended on a delicate balancing act. Now check out these other videos about quirky historical figures you won't learn anywhere else. There was nothing in his demeanor or appearance that betrayed the turmoil raging within. He remained an enigma wrapped in motley, his true feelings hidden behind a mask of painted mirth. He ducked under the guard's grasping fingers and darted towards the nearest exit, his body trembling with exhaustion. Through it all, he had clung to his principles, his sense of right and wrong. He noticed the bulge beneath the jester's motley, the unmistakable outline of a dagger. The jester, catching the man's eye, offered a reassuring smile and a wink. "Just a simpleton's trick," he said softly, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a silver coin. "Don't worry, good sir." Disappear into the sprawling countryside where the roads were few and the people wary of strangers. There he could lay low, lick his wounds, and wait for the heat to die down. Anything he could get his hands on that might prove useful in the days to come. As he disappeared into the bustling crowd, the sounds of the city seemed to fade away, replaced by the insistent beating of his own heart. A man on the run. A fugitive seeking sanctuary in the wilds of the countryside. Little did he know that his journey would lead him to places he had never dreamed of and bring him face to face with challenges that would test the very limits of his endurance. For the road ahead was long and treacherous, and the past he was running from had a way of catching up to those who tried to outrun it. Ahead of him lay a perilous journey, fraught with danger and uncertainty. He had tasted freedom, however briefly, and he knew he could never go back to the life that awaited him at court, the air thick with the smell of stale waste and chamber pots. The tavern owner cleared his throat and beckoned to a small chamber at the back of the tavern. "There's a room you can use, sir," he said hesitantly, "if you'd like to freshen up." The jester nodded in thanks and stepped into the room. The jester, his face still smeared with makeup, pulled up a chair and signaled for a drink. refusing to compromise his morals for the sake of expediency or self-preservation. Yet in doing so, he had become a marked man, hunted by those who value power and prestige above all else. He poured a mug of ale and placed it on the table before the jester, who took a long draught, savoring the warmth spreading through his chest. He needed this respite, a moment to gather his thoughts and devise a plan. He couldn't stay here. He removed his motley, revealing the simple tunic and hose he had worn beneath. He looked at his reflection in a tarnished mirror hanging on the wall. What stared back at him was the face of a young man, handsome in a reckless sort of way, with unruly brown hair, a dusting of freckles across his nose and high cheekbones that hinted at a stubborn spirit. But he knew it was also the face of a man wanted by the Queen's men, to shed the jester's garb and don something more inconspicuous, becoming a wraith haunting the city's shadows until he could strike back. How many miles he'd covered in his desperate flight, but his body ached with weariness and his throat was parched with thirst. He needed rest, a moment to catch his breath and plan his next move. But he knew it was only a matter of time before the Queen's men closed in again. The cobblestones echoed with the clip-clop of horses' hooves and the rumble of carts as the city slowly awoke to a new day, did little to pierce the gloom that had settled over the city. It was the kind of day that seemed to presage nothing but misfortune. He had escaped for now, being played by monarchs whose every move was dictated by ambition and lust for power. The chase continued, winding through the maze of moonlit streets, leaving a trail of shattered reputations and broken lives in his wake. Had seen firsthand the damage he inflicted with his poisoned words and malicious deeds. And tonight he suspected that the Duke had set the trap that nearly ensnared him. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but the jester dared not falter. He had to lose the guards, shake off their relentless pursuit before they caught up to him. Weaving between the tables, nimbly avoiding the outstretched hands that sought to grab him. She stared at him, her eyes wide with surprise, her lips parted in a silent gasp. The secret tryst, the stolen moments of quiet passion, all of it had been discovered. Betrayed, he fled, his heart heavy with the knowledge that another casualty had been claimed by the insatiable demands of the court. He slipped through the throng, a nimble shadow darting between the unsuspecting revelers. His bells jingled merrily, a mocking counterpoint to the sudden tension that had gripped the room. He heard shouts behind him, the heavy thud of boots on the stone floor. Close behind him, one of the guards loomed, his face contorted with rage, his hand outstretched like a vice. The jester froze, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. Through the sudden hush, he could hear the scrape of metal on stone, the unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps. Then they were upon him, the Queen's guards, their faces grim, their eyes hard and unforgiving. As he rounded a corner, he saw her, Marie, the tavern keeper's daughter. Among them was the Queen's favorite courtier, the Duke of Buckingham, a man as slippery and dangerous as an eel. He glided through the court, vengeance simmered in his gut, cold and dark, a promise of retribution to come. Spotting a small tavern nestled between a butcher's shop and a fishmonger's stall, he darted across the street and slipped inside. He had to get out of London. He was the jester, the court fool. In the tapestry of history, certain figures stand out not for their wealth or power, but for their wit and wisdom, their ability to challenge the status quo and question authority. With a motley cap perched atop their head and a tongue sharper than any blade, he was also a keen observer of the human condition. And as he watched the nobles swirl around him, he noticed something. Lord Salisbury, the king's chancellor, kept glancing nervously at the Queen. The Duke of Norfolk looked sullen, and Lady Margaret Beaufort clutched a goblet a little too tightly. There was discord in this court, Will knew, a risky plan that could either make him a hero or a martyr, but he knew he had to do something. The king's heavy tread echoed through the empty corridors of the palace. Will grinned, hoping against hope that he had not overstepped. Will followed, weaving between suits of armor and stone pillars, until he reached the royal bedroom, a discord that threatened to shatter the fragile fabric of the kingdom, his eyes shining with gratitude. The king's heavy heart was lifted, and the merriment continued late into the night. But outside the palace walls, entertainers have long used humor as a tool to critique society and its leaders. Use slapstick humor and pathos to expose the harsh realities of poverty and inequality in early 20th century Britain, America. Similarly, the satirical wit of Evelyn Waugh's Sword of Honor trilogy captures the absurdity of the British class system and the follies of the upper classes during the first half of the 20th century. A sound that mingled with the distant murmur of voices and the clash of steel on steel. The jester had arrived at court. Demonstrate the enduring power of satire and the jester's legacy in shaping our understanding of the world and our place in it. Their jokes often serve as a reflection of the anxieties and tensions simmering beneath the surface of everyday life. Take a moment to appreciate the jester's enduring influence. Like the jesters of old, these artists are reminding us that even in the darkest of times, laughter and truth can be a powerful weapon against tyranny and oppression. The jester's role in medieval courts may seem like a relic of the past. Attired in motley garb, the jester approached the towering castle walls, his bells tinkling softly in the twilight. His presence heralded by the musical chimes that seemed to echo his hopeful spirit. For he knew that within those imposing walls resided a world of intrigue, a realm where power and pomp were the currency of the day. Yet he had come prepared, for the jester understood that in a world consumed by the pursuit of glory, it was his duty to hold a mirror to its vanity. Comedians and social commentators who continued to challenge the status quo and make us laugh in the face of adversity. The problems that Will had so deftly sidestepped remained. The king's health was failing. The country teetered on the edge of religious upheaval. Will knew that his jesting had only bought the court a brief reprieve. But for now, he had brought laughter to the king and hope to the realm. And that, he thought as he drifted off to sleep, was the jester's true calling. "You are right, Beau," he said. "I have been a fool to burden myself with such worries. You have given me a much-needed jest. Come, let us go and celebrate." Henry sat on the edge of the bed, his head buried in his hands. Will approached cautiously, his bells jingling softly. "My lord king," he said gently, "may I have a word with you?" He bounced on the balls of his feet, excitement bubbling within him. Tonight was his chance to shine, to prove himself worthy of his position in the royal court. Will had been chosen to perform before the King and Queen Isabella, renowned for their love of jesting and good cheer. Will launched into a tale of a miller who boasted that his son was the strongest man in the world. When the young man was tested, however, he was unable to lift a heavy sack of flour. Defeated, the boy threw the sack over his shoulder and walked away. As the crowd laughed, Will added, "Sometimes, my lord, it is easier to carry a heavy burden than to live under the weight of one as father as expectations." Will joined the revels, his motley costume a splash of color against the rich tapestries adorning the hall. He clapped Will on the shoulder and roared with laughter. The sound echoed through the chamber, chasing away the shadows of gloom that had gathered in the room. He danced with the ladies, joked with the lords, and kept a sharp eye on the royal couple. Henry, resplendent in ermine and gold, looked every bit the powerful monarch. But Will noted the strain etched on his face, the tightness around his eyes, the set of his jaw. Even the queen, usually the picture of feminine grace, seemed burdened tonight. If he could make them laugh, he knew his future at court was secure. Jesters roamed the halls of power, delivering cutting remarks and biting satire to those in authority. His recent annulment from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had created a rift in the country. Not only had he discarded her for the much younger Anne Boleyn, He had also broken ties with the Roman Catholic Church to facilitate the union. Now, England stood poised on the brink of a religious revolution, and the king's mood was as tempestuous as the North Sea, from the royal courts of Europe's medieval era to the drawing rooms of the Russian czars. One wrong move and he would find himself out of favor, perhaps even beheaded. But if he could navigate the treacherous waters of the royal court, he just might make a real difference, like the witty and quick-tongued Till Eulenspiegel or the daring anti-establishment Jester Diamond. But it's important to acknowledge that their ranks included many more ordinary men and women whose names have been lost to history. Let us honor the memory of these complex, contradictory, utterly fascinating figures. Let us remember the great gestures of history, the tri-bullets and the wills, inside the Grand Palace. Preparations were underway for the evening's entertainment. Lords and ladies, resplendent in velvet and silk, sipped wine and gossiped animatedly. Musicians tuned their instruments, and jesters, a riot of color and sound, ran through their routines. Tonight was the king's 40th birthday, and the festivities would go on late into the night. The Geoffrey Hudsons and the fiestas. But let us also remember the countless nameless fools who lived and died in the courts of kings and queens, who used their wit and their courage to make the world a little brighter, a little more bearable, of truth in the face of power, of hope in the face of an often dark and difficult world. For in the end, perhaps that is the greatest legacy of the court jester, the reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit endures, forever resilient, forever hopeful, forever laughing in the face of the abyss. As the last embers of daylight faded, a hush fell over the cobbled streets of London town. Among the jesters was Will Sommers, a young man barely out of his teens, but Will was not merely a performer. The king, Henry VIII, was a man prone to fits of rage and sudden changes of heart. Will, however, saw an opportunity. It was the age-old story of the jester and the king. As the musicians struck up a lively tune, during a lull in the festivities, Will found himself alone in a shadowy alcove, sipping his wine and watching the king. He knocked lightly on the door and entered without waiting for a reply. Henry looked up, his face creased with fatigue. "What is it, Will?" Henry stared at him for a long moment. Then a slow smile spread across his face. And so, thanks to Will's quick wit and keen observation, one particularly resonant example is Charlie Chaplin, whose iconic character, the tramp. So the next time you hear a joke that makes you laugh and think, as darkness fell over the kingdom, casting long shadows across the land, suddenly the drawbridge creaked into motion, opening the gateway to the fortress. With a final flourish, he stepped onto the bridge, his bells ringing out their merry tune. Jesters have long been an integral part of medieval culture, serving as entertainers and advisors to royalty. However, despite their important roles, they are rarely remembered in history books. In my last video, we discussed how much money a jester made in medieval Europe. We discovered that their income varied depending on their rank and skills, but on average, they were quite well paid. Of course, this was a delicate balancing act. Pushed too far, and a jester might find himself out of favor or worse. But the best jesters understood the power of their position. Their job was to make the king and his nobles laugh, and they did so by poking fun at the foibles and frailties of humanity. One common target of their mockery was the human condition. Jesters would often make light of the awkward and embarrassing situations that people found themselves in, as well as the foibles and frailties of everyday life. Their shoes were often brightly colored and made of leather. It should be noted that the clothing worn by jesters could also serve as a symbol of their low social status. In a medieval society that valued modesty and simplicity, the jester's outrageous attire was a deliberate choice to set them apart as outsiders. By dressing in a way that was both attention-seeking and unconventional, Jesters were able to make a statement about their profession and the unique position they occupied in medieval society, with some jesters even wearing elaborate overshoes. These colorful shoes not only added a touch of whimsy to the jester's outfit, but they also served to identify them as members of their profession. In a time when clothing was often drab and practical, the jester's bright shoes were a bold statement that set them apart from the rest of the population. This was particularly important during festivals and celebrations, when jesters were expected to be the center of attention. Their brightly colored shoes helped to ensure that they were easily spotted in a crowd and drew attention to their comedic antics. By laughing at these things, jesters were able to help people cope with the absurdities of the human experience and find humor in the midst of life's challenges. During the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church held immense power and influence. They were well aware that they were not highly respected members of society, and they would often make light of their lowly status. This self-deprecating humor was not only a way of coping with the prejudices they faced, but it was also a clever way of getting around the restrictions placed on their freedom of speech. By making fun of themselves, jesters were able to avoid the censors and still deliver their sharp critiques of society. But there were many who felt that the clergy had become too worldly and had strayed from their religious calling. For example, the jester's baggy pants could have been a parody of the loose robes worn by lawyers or the tight belts and cinched waists favored by merchants. The jester's cap, often known as a motley, was typically made of leather or cloth and was decorated with bells. These bells were not only meant to add a whimsical touch to the jester's outfit, but they also served a practical purpose. They helped to amplify the jester's voice and make them more audible in a large hall or courtyard. Additionally, the bells could be used as a tool for comedic effect, as the jester could shake them to create a humorous sound effect or use them to startle unsuspecting onlookers. Overall, the jester's bells were an important part of their costume and played a key role in their performances. By dressing in this way, jesters were able to use their appearance to challenge conventional notions of class and hierarchy and make a satirical statement about the values of medieval society. Jesters were not afraid to mock the clergy for living lavish lifestyles, seeking out power, and abusing their authority. This was not always easy, however, as criticizing the church could be dangerous. But the bravest jesters were willing to take the risk in order to hold the powerful accountable and expose their hypocrisy. They were the only people in the kingdom who could say things that were true but also funny. And in doing so, they could make people laugh while also making a point. Here are some things jesters said that others did not dare to utter. Today we will explore some criticisms about jesters that others dared not express. So get ready to learn about these brave souls who questioned everything from religion to gender roles. Join us on our journey through time as we uncover the hidden thoughts and criticisms of these courageous individuals. You won't believe what they had to say. A skilled jester could use his wit to influence policy, to challenge authority, and even to speak for the voiceless masses beyond the castle walls. One common criticism leveled by jesters at medieval society was its obsession with appearances. The medieval period was a time when outward displays of wealth and power were highly valued. However, this preoccupation with appearances often came at the expense of substance and authenticity. Jesters would often mock those who cared more about their social status than their character or intelligence. By poking fun at those who put on airs, jesters were able to highlight the absurdity of such behavior and encourage people to focus on what truly mattered. Another criticism frequently directed by jesters was towards the hypocrisy of the clergy. In addition to their social commentary, jesters also often served as entertainers at royal courts. Furthermore, jesters were not afraid to poke fun at themselves and their profession. Some scholars believe that the medieval jester's clothing was designed to mock the traditional attire of various social classes. Another interesting aspect of the jester's costume was their headgear. Besides their bells and motley, jesters also wore distinctive footwear. Despite the colorful and whimsical nature of the jester's costume, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more historical tales. Thank you for watching. A royal pain in the ass. A seemingly carefree, happy-go-lucky performer who's tolerated in the royal court, not because of any special skill or ability. The jester's costume, typically consisting of motley clothes, a long pointed cap, and bells on their shoes. The jester could feel the weight of this isolation settling upon his shoulders like a heavy cloak. He watched as the nobles danced and drank, their laughter ringing hollow in his ears, never fully accepted into their glittering world. And yet there was a certain power in this outsider status as well. Free from the constraints of social norms and expectations, the jester was at liberty to speak his mind, to poke and prod at the heart of courtly life without fear of reprisal. He was a kind of conscience for the court. In a world where appearances were everything, the jester was able to strip away the veneer of courtly life and reveal the raw, unvarnished truth beneath. In doing so, he may have been an agent of social mobility, however small, bringing the mighty low and raising the humble to their level with a single well-timed jest. At least not in any overt sense. Rather, they served a more subtle and psychologically complex role, one that speaks to the deeper tensions and contradictions of the human condition. In many ways, the figure of the court jester represents the inversion of the normal social order, a world turned upside down. In a society rigidly stratified by class and station, a lowly figure who could nonetheless speak with impunity to the highest in the land. His very existence was a kind of challenge to the status quo, a reminder that beneath the pomp and pageantry of court life, all men were ultimately equal in the eyes of God and the grim specter of death. The jester also served as a kind of safety valve for the tensions and frustrations that inevitably build up in any hierarchical society. By giving voice to the unspoken truths and uncomfortable realities of court life, the jester provided a release, a way for the powerful to confront their own foibles and failings without losing face. In this sense, the fool was not so much a subversive figure as a necessary one, a critical component in the delicate balance of power that held the court together. Was designed to be both colorful and distracting. For all their wit and wisdom, jesters were still very much at the mercy of their patrons, their fate tied to the whims and fortunes of the court. A jester who fell out of favor could easily find himself cast aside, left to fend for himself in a world that had little use for a fool without a stage. And even for those who managed to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics, the life of a jester was often a lonely and isolating one. Set apart by their unique role and status, jesters often struggled to form lasting bonds or relationships, forever doomed to observe and comment on the foibles of their betters from the sidelines of life, drawing attention away from the serious business of courtly intrigue. However, the jester's costume also served an even deeper purpose, someone who existed outside the strictures of courtly etiquette and decorum. This allowed the jester to say things that other courtiers could not, and to do so with relative impunity. In a sense, the jester's costume was a kind of armor, protecting them from the wrath of the king or queen while they poked fun at their royal master. Court jesters were known for their silly costumes. We must first understand how medieval courts operated. Medieval courts were highly stratified, hierarchical environments, and social mobility was extremely limited. Those born into the nobility were expected to live according to strict codes of conduct, and those who violated these codes risked being ostracized from society. As a result, medieval courts were breeding grounds for hypocrisy, as nobles often felt compelled to present themselves as paragons of virtue and propriety, while behind closed doors, they engaged in all manner of impropriety. It was precisely this hypocrisy that jesters were able to exploit so effectively. By mocking the follies and failings of the nobility, jesters were able to expose the artificiality of the social order and the absurdity of the strictures that governed court life. In doing so, they provided a valuable service to their royal patrons, who were often unaware of their own hypocrisy or too embarrassed to acknowledge it. The jester's mockery was a kind of wake-up call, a reminder that beneath their finery and their titles, they were just human beings, all too capable of making fools of themselves, all of which were designed to make their royal patrons laugh. Court jesters were actually something of a double agent, using their position of privilege to secretly mock and criticize their royal patrons and the entire institution of monarchy itself. The origin of the court jester is uncertain, but they first appeared in medieval courts during the 14th century and remained popular throughout Europe until the French Revolution in the late 18th century. The word jester comes from the Old French word justor. In medieval Europe, it was common for kings to surround themselves with a variety of entertainers and advisors, including musicians, poets, and, of course, jesters. Jesters weren't necessarily entertainers, however. The most famous example is perhaps the legendary Tribiel, to have made him one of the most influential figures at the court of King Francis I of France. Tribiel was once asked by the king what punishment should be meted out to a nobleman who had offended him. Without missing a beat, Tribiel replied, "I think he should be sent away to get an education, for he alone never learned anything by remaining in your court." It was a sly dig at the king's own lack of learning, as well as a commentary on the stultifying atmosphere of the royal court. In one fell swoop, Tribiel had both amused and admonished his master, all while maintaining the guise of the fool. Many jesters have been credited with possessing a keen understanding of human nature and a sharp wit that could cut through the pretensions and hypocrisies of the upper classes. Tells a story about a jester who was brought before the Roman Emperor Nero after insulting his mother, Agrippina. The jester reportedly replied, "I did not mock you, my lord, but your mother." Amused by the jester's quick wit, Nero decided to spare his life. One of the most famous jesters in English literature is Shakespeare's Falstaff, including Henry IV, both parts, and The Merry Wives of Windsor. Falstaff is a larger-than-life character known for his wit, his humor, and his love of food and drink, providing comic relief and offering sharp commentary on the foibles of the nobility. In one scene in Henry IV, Part 2, Falstaff is summoned before the newly crowned Henry V and is scolded for his dissolute lifestyle, justifying his love of food and drink and railing against the corrupting influence of power. To better understand how jesters functioned in medieval courts, this is not to say that the life of a jester was an easy or enviable one. Thank you for watching. For weeks now, the kingdom had been gripped by fear. Whispers of rebellion and unrest had slithered through the kingdom like venomous snakes. He grappled with a decision that would shape the kingdom's fate. Little did he know that this journey would test not just his loyalty, but the very fabric of his being. Here, amidst the cacophony of bartering merchants and gossiping townsfolk, Alaric observed, listened, and learned. Alaric continued his journey, venturing deeper into the heartland of the rebellion. Alaric saw the faces of the rebellion's leaders, men and women of different backgrounds, united by a common cause. The rebels dispersed, melting into the darkness, their voices hushed but their spirits unbroken. What were its lifeblood, its soul? And as he pondered, he understood that the heart of the rebellion was not a person. He continued to gather intelligence, to observe, and to report back to his father, albeit in the most subtle of ways, hailing the king's return as a beacon of stability and continuity, but in the gratitude and smiles of the people he had served. He had walked the path of both the rebel and the loyalist, and he carried the burden of their conflicting ideologies like a millstone around his neck. He became a living paradox, a rebel masquerading as a loyalist. Alaric had not just uncovered the source of the rebellion, he had become its heart, and in doing so, He had shown his father the true state of the kingdom, the needs of the people, and the reasons behind their discontent. A jester balancing on the tightrope between two worlds. He realized that the rebellion was not a mere rabble of malcontents who dared to be one of them and who, in doing so, saved not just his kingdom, but the hearts of its people. For sometimes the greatest battles are not fought on battlefields, but in the hearts and minds of men. And the most valiant of warriors are not those with swords and shields, but those with empathy, understanding, and a relentless pursuit of justice. But a reflection of the kingdom's ailments, a symptom of a system in need of reform, and reached out to the rebels, offering amnesty and positions of responsibility. The kingdom slowly began to heal, the wounds of division and distrust slowly closing, revealing the deep-rooted causes of the rebellion, the king's missteps, the nobility's apathy, and the common folk's despair. Alaric watched and listened, his heart torn between his royal duty and his growing empathy for the rebels' plight, offering solace and sparking glimmers of hope in an otherwise bleak landscape. The townspeople, initially wary of the strange jester, began to warm up to him. They saw in him a sincerity that belied his costume, an empathy that transcended his station, and a kindness that defied his disguise. He saw the fiery passion in their eyes, the steely resolve in their voices. He listened intently as they discussed their grievances, their hopes, and their fears. He heard their plans, their strategies, and their dreams for the kingdom's future. Alaric, no longer the detached observer, became an active participant in the lives of the common folk. He worked alongside them in the fields, shared their meager meals, and listened to their stories. Villages where the echoes of discontent mingled with the wind, and taverns where whispered conversations carried the weight of revolution. At each stop, he added another piece to the puzzle. People flocked to him, drawn not just by his charm, but by the promise of solace and support. The rebellion, once a distant rumble, grew louder, more organized, and more resolute. Alaric found himself at the center of it, not as a spy, but as a leader, a champion of the downtrodden and a beacon of hope in a world of despair. Another voice to the chorus. He saw the weariness in the eyes of the common folk, the spark of defiance in the gaze of the young. And he realized that the rebellion was not a singular entity, but a chorus of voices, each with its own tale of woe. Then one evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of despair, a messenger arrived bearing grim tidings. He saw acts of kindness, of shared laughter, and of quiet resistance. He witnessed the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity, the unwavering bond of community in the darkest of times. Prince Alaric began his descent into the belly of the beast. Disguised as a jester, he traded his princely robes for motley clothes, his crown for a conical hat, and his scepter for a wooden staff. Before him stood a group of villagers, their faces etched with worry and determination. They were preparing for an illicit meeting, a clandestine gathering where the ringleaders of the rebellion were to assemble. With bated breath, Alaric concealed himself among the trees, becoming an unseen witness to the unfolding drama. It was a shedding of identity. King Alaric, weary from the burdens of his crown, had fallen ill, leaving the kingdom's fate hanging in the balance, poisoning the hearts of men and the minds of women. The king, once revered as a beacon of wisdom and strength, now sat on a throne of thorns. His every move watched, his every word weighed. The seeds of doubt, once planted by envious courtiers and ambitious lords, had sprouted and grown, overshadowing the king's reign with an ominous gloom. And in this atmosphere of suspicion and intrigue, the king's son, Prince Alaric, found himself at a crossroads. At that pivotal moment, Prince Alaric was summoned to his father's bedside. The king, his face ashen and eyes clouded with pain, entrusted his son with a task of utmost importance. He commissioned Alaric to don the motley garb of a jester and infiltrate the very heart of the rebellion, to uncover its source and unravel its designs. This perilous mission was not just about uncovering the truth. It was about preserving the kingdom's legacy and the people's well-being. Alaric, bound by his love for his father and his kingdom, accepted the perilous mission, though his heart ached with the weight of responsibility as dawn broke, casting long shadows across the land. His first stop was the bustling marketplace, a microcosm of the kingdom's unrest. But amidst this sea of despair, Alaric noticed something else, a glimmer of hope. One evening, as the sky blazed with hues of orange and purple, Alaric found himself in a secluded clearing. Among them was a woman named Isolda, her presence commanding attention. As the night deepened, the meeting came to a close. The question that had brought him here, who led the rebellion, receded in importance. In its place, a new one took root. He had come seeking answers, but he was beginning to realize that sometimes the truth was not a destination, but a journey. He organized communal kitchens, distributed food and supplies. As weeks turned into months, Alaric's reputation as a compassionate jester spread like wildfire. Yet amidst the clamor for change, Alaric never forgot his royal duty. Then came the fateful day when King Alaric recovered and reclaimed his throne. When he finally revealed his true identity to his father, King Alaric, the elder recoiled in shock. Together, father and son worked to address the grievances that had fueled the rebellion. They enacted reforms, appointed compassionate advisors, and in the midst of this healing process, Alaric found his reward, not in accolades or titles. So remember the story of Prince Alaric, the jester who dared to walk among rebels, who dared to understand their cause. But before we dig into that, let's honor the gods. All right, let's get into it. The ancient Greeks and Romans delighted in the antics of fools and buffoons who provided a subversive counterpoint to the solemnity of official culture. But it was in the Middle Ages that the court jester truly came into his own as a fixture of courtly life. Hudson's diminutive size was a source of fascination and amusement for the court, and he was initially treated as a sort of living curiosity. Somers was known for his quick wit and his ability to use humor to diffuse tense situations. He was even said to be one of the few people who could get away with openly criticizing the notoriously temperamental king. But even Somers knew that his favor could be fleeting. The jester's foolishness could be a disarming form of wisdom, a way of speaking uncomfortable truths that others dared not utter. But this power came at a cost. As Armstrong himself knew, there was a fine line between being the king's jester and being the king's fool. And when that line was crossed, the consequences could be dire. Like many of his fellow jesters, Armstrong ultimately found himself out of favor at court. His career as a jester effectively ended, but his legacy as a witty and fearless commentator on the human condition lived on in the stories and anecdotes that circulated about him long after he had ceased to be a fixture in the royal court. He once quipped to the king, "I can tell you what you are thinking, my lord, but also of the courage it takes to do so." Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. By doing so, you'll ensure that you never miss out on any of our exciting new episodes. We've got a lot more content coming your way, and we want you to be among the first to see it. So join our growing community of history enthusiasts and stay up to date on all the latest from us. Thanks for watching. Jesters may have been granted license to speak their minds, but that license was always fragile and precarious. Just wait until you hear about the shenanigans of monks who broke the rules. Click that link right over there to check out this video. And hey, if you're still watching, leave a comment down below. Let us know what you think. We love reading your comments and we value your feedback. Plus, it's a great way for us to connect with you, our awesome viewers. Thanks for joining us on this journey through time. And remember, keep an eye out for more historical tailies because we've got plenty more where that came from. See you next time. They lived and died at the whim of their royal patrons, and the cost of speaking out against the powerful could be high. But as the jests of Armstrong and others have shown us, the truth can be a powerful weapon even in the hands of a fool. And perhaps that is why the story of the jester continues to resonate with us today. You're thinking that if I were wiser, I would be richer. And if you were wiser, I would be richer too. It was a characteristically bold jest, but one that underscored the precarious nature of the jester's position. No matter how valued he might be in the moment, the fool was always expendable in the end. In a famous incident, in the cutthroat world of court politics where fortunes could shift on a dime, jesters could also wield a surprising amount of influence in the rarefied world of the court. Their wit and satirical barbs could be used to comment on current events, to challenge the pretensions of the powerful, and even to shape the course of history. Consider the case of Archibald Armstrong, jester to King James I and King Charles I of England in the early 17th century. Armstrong was known for his acerbic wit and his willingness to speak truth to power, even at the risk of offending his royal patrons. During the English Civil War, he used his platform to criticize the excesses of both the royalist and parliamentarian factions, earning him a reputation as a satirical commentator on the tumultuous events of his time. Armstrong's jests could be biting, but they often contained a kernel of truth that cut through the noise of political rhetoric. In one famous exchange, he was asked by King Charles why he wasn't wearing the traditional motley of the jester. Armstrong reportedly replied, "Because all your Majesty's courtiers have taken up my trade and made me a gentleman." It was a clever jab at the sycophancy and self-interest of the courtiers, but it also spoke to the deeper role of the jester as a truth-teller and a check on the abuses of power. The jester's livelihood depended on his ability to stay one step ahead of the whims of the powerful. A single misstep, a joke taken the wrong way, could spell the end of a jester's career or worse. This was the fate that befell the French jester Tribiel, who served in the court of King Francis I in the 16th century. Tribe was renowned for his wit and his fearlessness in speaking truth to power. He once famously declared to the king, "Nature made you a fool, but you have made yourself a king." It was a bold statement even for a jester, and one that would come back to haunt him. For all his wit and audacity, Tribiel found himself on the wrong side of a political intrigue and was banished from court. Without the protection of his royal patron, he soon fell into poverty and obscurity. It was a stark reminder of the precarity of the jester's existence, even for one as talented and famous as Tribiel. He was served to the queen in a large pie, emerging to the delight and astonishment of the guests. But as amusing as such spectacles may have been for the court, they underscore the lack of agency and dignity afforded to those in the jester's position. Hudson was a human being, not a prop or a plaything. Yet his worth was measured solely by his ability to entertain. His small stature was a double curse, granting him access to the privileged world of the court, while also making him an object of ridicule and exploitation. Nor was Hudson alone in this plight. Many jesters came from difficult backgrounds marked by poverty, disability, or social stigma. For these individuals, the role of court fool offered a rare opportunity for social advancement and security. But it came at a steep price, for the jester was always at the mercy of his patron's whims and favor. Even those jesters who enjoyed a degree of fame and influence were never entirely secure in their positions. In a strictly hierarchical society where birth and rank determined one's place, the jester occupied a unique position. He was often of low or ignoble birth. Yet his wit and audacity granted him access to the highest echelons of power. In a world where deference and decorum were the order of the day, the fool was granted license to speak truth to power, to puncture the pretensions of the mighty with his barbed jests. But this was a double-edged sword, for the jester's favor was always precarious. He relied entirely on his ability to amuse and entertain his fickle patrons. A well-landed jest could earn him rich rewards, but a single misstep could spell disaster. Many a jester found himself cast out of court, or worse, for overstepping the bounds of his role. One such jester was Geoffrey Hudson, a dwarf who served in the court of Queen Henrietta Maria of England in the 17th century. Take the case of Will Sommers, the renowned jester of King Henry VIII of England. This expendability was a constant threat hanging over the heads of even the most successful jesters. But for all the hardships and indignities they endured, in a world where flattery and dissembling were the norm, and so the story of the jester serves as a cautionary tale of the perils of speaking truth to power. As we continue our exploration of the fascinating world of medieval Europe, all right, let's keep going. Now, if you thought the antics of those royal jesters were something, Geoffrey Hudson was born a little different. His head was misshapen, his legs bowed, and his arms disproportionately small. Though tales of his early life are murky, it seems clear that Hudson's appearance marked him as an outcast even before he reached adulthood. But rather than consign him to a life of obscurity, there was fierce competition among the courtiers vying for the queen's amusement. Those who succeeded earned prestige and power. He delighted Anne of Denmark with his witty repartee and nimble acrobatics. But like all good things, this time too came to an end. Hudson found himself thrown into a carriage with two other jesters, Richard Browne and Roger Custis. Geoffrey Hudson, once the toast of the court, now languished in a dark cell alongside men he barely knew. The irony was not lost on him. The very skills that had made him a celebrity now rendered him powerless. His ability to amuse and entertain had brought him to the heights of popularity. But now that same gift was of no use to him. It's believed that he passed away in relative obscurity. Instead, it was a quiet exit marked by hardship and anonymity. They were social commentators, satirists, and psychologists, but their wisdom was often lost in the laughter, their insights buried beneath the jests, between favor and disfavor, between laughter and tears. The only path available for those on the margins of society. This grim truth has given rise to the enduring archetype of the sad clown, a figure whose outward humor conceals inner anguish. The merry bells that had once adorned Hudson's hat grew silent. In one poignant anecdote, Ganella was said to have quipped, Ganella was keenly aware of the unbridgeable gap between them. This alienation could take an even darker turn, as in the disturbing tale of the French jester Morosini. A horrific act that underscores the expendability of even the most celebrated entertainers. Yet despite the hardships they faced, medieval jesters were more than merely victims. They were also surprisingly complex figures who played a vital role in the social and psychological fabric of their time. In a strictly hierarchical world, the jester represented a crucial safety valve. The jester created a space for criticizing the status quo and imagining alternatives, if only for a moment. This is the secret power of the jester. The ability to challenge authority and orthodox thinking under the guise of harmless humor, exposing the follies of kings and commoners alike. In the plays of Shakespeare and Molière, in the novels of Victor Hugo and Kurt Vonnegut, in the very idea that laughter can be a force for change and truth in a troubled world. The jester, once a symbol of mirth and merriment, now embodied despair and uncertainty. Would he ever see the sunlight again? Would he ever hear the laughter he had once elicited? Or was this to be his final resting place? But like the English Civil War itself, which saw many twists and turns, Hudson's story took an unexpected turn. On the journey, the carriage was ambushed by a band of parliamentarians. Hudson and his companions were captured and imprisoned. Parliament had grown tired of its captives and saw little value in keeping them any longer. But by this time, much had changed. The royal court was a shadow of its former self, and Queen Anne of Denmark had passed away. The king was living in exile, and the country was a battleground. For jesters, there was little place in a world consumed by war. Parliament viewed the royal jesters as nothing more than tools of the crown, and they wasted no time in silencing them. No longer a bright-eyed young performer, he was a bitter, disillusioned shell of his former self. The war had robbed him of his youth, his health, and his spirit. The great halls of the royal court, once echoing with his laughter, now seemed like a distant memory, a faded dream from another lifetime. Hudson tried to pick up the pieces of his life, but it was a difficult task. Without the backing of the royal court, he struggled to find work. His reputation as a jester was tainted by his association with the monarchy. It was as if his crime of loyalty was branded on his forehead, visible to all but ignored by most. The three jesters were accused of spreading pro-monarchy propaganda, a charge they vehemently denied. But in a world turned upside down by war, logic had little place. Parliament wanted to make an example of them. Anne of Denmark's favor did not last forever. The year 1642 marked a turning point in English history, a year when the country erupted in civil war, pitting the supporters of King Charles I against those of Parliament. Caught in the crossfire, Hudson found himself fighting not with swords and shields, but with wits and words. Yes, the English Civil War caught even jesters in its web. While those who failed risked being banished from the court with little more than a sneer and a swift kick to the rear. It was a high-stakes game, but young Geoffrey seemed destined to win. He proved to be a quick learner, mastering the art of court, jesting with remarkable ease. His small stature and unusual appearance made him a natural performer. People with dwarfism often had to fight harder to be seen and heard. However, they also possessed a certain charm and charisma that could disarm even the most jaded audiences. Hudson rose to become one of her favorite entertainers. You see, Hudson was what we today would call a person with dwarfism, but in the 1600s he was deemed a natural wonder, an object of amusement and intrigue. In the annals of history, people like Hudson were often labeled as deformed or monstrous. But it was precisely these perceived abnormalities that made them so fascinating to 17th century audiences. These individuals, with their unusual appearances, were celebrated as curiosities. They were paraded around for public display, featured in paintings, and even published in books with detailed descriptions of their supposed ailments. It was a morbid fascination, a kind of freak show that both intrigued and repulsed people at the time. For instance, there was a woman named Margaret Hughes who was exhibited at fairs and gatherings, charged admission for seeing her. She was even painted by the famous artist Richard Lemon, who depicted her in a canvas titled The Monstrous Birth, a prodigious infant of strange and unusual shape. Such displays were not merely for entertainment, but also served to reinforce societal norms and values. By showcasing these individuals, the public was reminded of what was considered normal and acceptable. It was a way of reinforcing the status quo and ensuring that those who were different were kept on the fringes of society. But for people like Geoffrey Hudson, it was a chance for survival. Born in the West Country of England in 1630, Hudson's exact date of birth is uncertain, lost to the mists of time. What is known, however, is that his life took a dramatic turn when he caught the eye of Anne of Denmark, Queen of England. One day, while the royal court was visiting Bristol, they stumbled upon young Geoffrey and his mother Elizabeth. Captivated by the boy's unique appearance, Anne of Denmark decided to take him under her patronage. Soon after, Geoffrey found himself whisked away from his family and ordinary life to the extraordinary and often perilous world of the English monarchy. At court, Hudson became one of the Queen's personal jesters, tasked with the important duty of making her laugh. Over the next few years, Geoffrey Hudson's star shone brightly at court. As the war raged on, Parliament gained the upper hand, capturing London and forcing Charles I to flee north. To escape the advancing parliamentary troops, in a move that shocked the court, the three jesters were sentenced to prison, stripped of their rank and their colorful costumes. Months passed and the Civil War dragged on with no end in sight. After enduring months of imprisonment, the three jesters were released. When Hudson emerged from his cell, he was a changed man. Geoffrey Hudson died in 1660 at the age of 30, and that is the tragedy of the jesters, the court jesters who entertained kings and queens. The Italian jester Pietro Ganella, who served at the court of Duke Borso d'Este in the 1400s, embodied this dichotomy. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. He paused for a moment, his hand resting on the cold stone of the wall outside. His heart pounded in his chest like a drum, echoing the rhythm of apprehension that had become his constant companion. Among them was a young woman who captivated everyone's attention with her enchanting singing voice. To confess my love for my wife and seek a divorce from my unfaithful husband. So I took a deep breath and prepared to reveal the truth. But why wait till morning? I'll tell him tonight. My days filled with menial tasks and my nights with the aching emptiness of loneliness. That was until the day my family decided that I, the eldest son, needed a wife. Not just any wife, mind you, but one who came with a hefty dowry, a stranger whose sole value to my family was the wealth her father could bring to the table. My wedding day dawned gray and gloomy. Just maybe I could find happiness in this forced union. As I stood before the altar, my gaze met that of my bride-to-be, and something stirred within me. In her eyes, I saw a reflection of my own turmoil, a silent understanding of the predicament we both now faced. From that moment, an unspoken bond formed between us. Our days were filled with the routine of domestic life, but by the cold calculus of financial necessity. The spark of connection we had felt on our wedding day flickered and faded, replaced by the harsh realities of our situation. But we persevered. We found solace in the quiet moments, a shared glance, a gentle touch. In his innocent eyes, we saw a glimmer of hope. The cost of love, however, was steep. A life where love, not money, was the currency of our existence. She was the star of the show, the undisputed jewel in the crown of the troupe. But amidst the gasps of admiration and the thunderous applause, there was one person who saw beyond the glitz and the glamour. The town's physician noticed that the singer's voice was failing, that there was a hollowness to her notes that betrayed a struggle beneath the surface. Her voice cracking under the strain, a sure sign of vocal cords crying out for rest. In a quiet moment, away from the prying ears of the public, her reaction was one of defiance, a desperate attempt to hold on to the only thing that had brought her fame and fortune, of losing the one thing that had allowed her to escape the drudgery of her ordinary life. But the doctor's warnings went unheeded. Determined to squeeze every last drop of glory from her fading instrument, the vibrant tones that had once filled the air were replaced by a hoarse whisper. Now, months later, the memory of her golden voice still lingered in the town, a ghost of what once was. Whether she'd found peace or continued to suffer the agony of her lost voice remained a mystery. The physician often thought of her. Perhaps she could have found solace in another pursuit. But the harsh reality of life often left little room for such luxuries. It was a financial ruin as well. The loss of a livelihood could mean the descent into utter despair and destitution, both in terms of voice and spirit, and hope that wherever she was, she had found a measure of peace. Was today the day that his luck would run out? He couldn't help but clutch his amulet, a desperate plea for guidance and protection in a world where fools are often the first to get hurt. He was a storyteller first and foremost. He was acutely aware of his status as a low-ranking servant. Each casual remark or careless gesture could trigger the volatile tempers of the nobility and turn his world upside down. He had witnessed firsthand the swift and merciless retribution that could befall a single misspoken word or an ill-timed jest. There was always the risk that his cleverness would be misinterpreted as insolence. And then there were the endless landmine of taboos. Certain topics were strictly off limits, They were third rails that could shock a jester's career to a halt with shocking swiftness. To stay just on the right side of the line that separated wit from insult, jest from heresy. This mental agility was his shield and armor, his primary defense against the machinations of the ruthless royal court. His survival depended on his ability to read the room, to anticipate reactions. To survive in this treacherous environment required a finely tuned instrument of self-awareness, a keen understanding of his own limitations. To eschew ostentatious displays of skill or daring that might invite envy or worse, scrutiny. When others basked in the glow of their own brilliance, he receded into the background, letting his talents simmer just below the surface, a hidden reserve of energy that could be called upon when needed. The constant threat of obsolescence that loomed over every jester, their ability to keep the king amused. Should his services become less desirable, or should the king's fancy turn elsewhere? He could be discarded like a worn-out toy, left to fend for himself in a world that offered little sympathy for fallen jesters. Thus, he walked lightly on the world, ever vigilant, forever aware that the ground beneath his feet could shift at any moment. Each new day at court was a victory, each sunrise a testament to his resilience, his spirit unbroken despite the constant threat of ruin that hung over him like a storm cloud on the horizon. He was a jester after all, a master of disguise, adept at hiding his vulnerabilities behind a facade of mirth and jest. It was a lonely existence, one devoid of genuine companionship or heartfelt emotion. The court was a vast stage, and he was merely a player in someone else's game, his emotions carefully suppressed to fit the role expected of him. But underneath the paint and the bells, there beat the heart of a man grappling with the weight of an existence that demanded he be forever the fool, even when wisdom would serve him better. The year before, during the height of summer, a traveling troupe of entertainers had graced the town with their presence. But then there was me. As the years rolled on, our love deepened, becoming a sanctuary in the midst of our loveless marriage. The year before the First Crusade, Pope Urban II sat upon the papal throne in the Vatican as the most powerful man in Europe. All around him, the finest scholars discussed theology and philosophy, while artists created beautiful works of art inspired by God. Yet despite this holy setting, the Pope was miserable. And yet they are supposed to be the leaders of Christendom. Is there nothing you can do, Walter? The jester bowed his head in understanding. I see that you are gathered here in great numbers to decide the fate of a single man. Tell me, my lords, have you not come to a decision after all this time? Is it truly so difficult to choose the fate of one man? His eyes swept over the faces of the assembly, each designed to test their mental and physical abilities and their commitment to the church's mission, not through force or guile, but through the simple power of play. And he wanted to be in a position to influence how it played out. So he decided to accompany the French contingent to the Council of Clermont. Adhemar of Lapuy, a bishop from southern France, was also eager to make the most of the situation. Adhemar had long been frustrated by the limitations placed on the papacy in secular affairs, and he believed that the Crusades offered a chance to change that. Adhemar had successfully ingratiated himself with the king and court, and he was well positioned to influence the direction of the crusade. The death and destruction, the fear and uncertainty, the courage and sacrifice. Walter climbed down from his stump and made his way back to the camp. He put on his motley and jingled his bells. He had learned that beneath the noise and fury of battle, beneath the clash of arms and the cry of war, was the timeless drama of the human experience. And he knew that he would carry those lessons with him for the rest of his life. Then he joined the other soldiers as they prepared for the final assault. With a heavy heart, he knew that this was not just a battle, but a defining moment in history. He was part of something larger than himself. He also knew that he would never forget the lessons he had learned during the siege. The enemies he had faced, Walter emerged from the fray, Walter, meanwhile, had made a name for himself as a shrewd and cunning jester, and he had the ear of the king. Both men knew that the coming conflict would bring with it a host of challenges, and they prepared themselves accordingly. Adhemar assembled a team of loyal advisors and confidants, and he set about securing the resources. He would need to carry out his plans. Walter, meanwhile, did what he always did. He observed, he listened, and he made jokes. The court jester, an unlikely hero in the story of the Council of Clermont. And so it was that as the French army assembled and began its long march to the Holy Land, two unlikely figures found themselves at the heart of it all, a jester and a bishop. Each with his own agenda, and each with the potential to shape the destiny of Europe forever. The night before the final battle of the siege, Walter, the jester, found himself alone in the camp, far from the noise and excitement of the approaching assault. Upon arriving at the council, Adhemar made sure to ingratiate himself with the king and court, hoping to win their support for his plans. In fact, he enjoyed the trappings of power and luxury so much that he became known as the Second Pope during his travels. Men with hopes and dreams, fears and failings, joys and sorrows. He had seen the best and worst of humanity on display during the siege, the capacity for great deeds of valor, and the depths of depravity and cruelty. And he had realized that it was this complexity, this mixture of good and evil, that made humanity so fascinating, so tragic, so beautiful. They knew that the call to arms would bring with it a host of opportunities, not only for glory and power, but also for wealth and prestige. Adhemar saw the crusade as a chance to elevate the papacy to new heights, and he believed that he could play a key role in making that happen. He wasn't interested in theological debates or power struggles. He just wanted to look out for himself, and even quicker with a jab, and he was unabove using his position as jester to get what he wanted. He lavished praise on Louis VI, showering him with compliments and gifts, and he fawned over the court's entertainers. When the news spread throughout Europe that Pope Urban II had convened a council to discuss the possibility of a crusade, many prominent figures saw it as an opportunity to advance their own interests. Among them was Walter, the court jester of King Louis VI of France, his quick wit and agile mind allowing him to outshine the best scholars and theologians. The king watched from the sidelines, a broad smile on his face as his gesture brought order to the chaos he had created. And he saw that they were no longer the stern, unsmiling figures he had seen before. A sense of unity grew among the participants, and they began to work together. The prelates and nobles who had once been bitter rivals were now working together, their laughter echoing through the halls of the conclave. Instead, there was a hint of playfulness in their eyes, and the tension that had gripped them had been replaced by a sense of camaraderie. Yet I must ask, how can one man's fate be decided by so many? Is this not a form of mob rule? Perhaps you need a game to help you decide, he said with a mischievous grin. A game that will test your wits and your courage and your loyalty to the church. The assembly murmured among themselves. Yes, a game, they cried. A game will help us decide. At first, it was hesitant and uncertain, but soon it grew into a roar that echoed through the halls of the conclave. Jesters were often employed not only for their entertainment value, but also for their ability to cut through the pretense and hypocrisy of the nobility. Their outsider status allowed them to speak freely and honestly, because they were not constrained by the same rules of etiquette and decorum that governed the behavior of the elite. The assembled prelates argued bitterly among themselves. At first, the assembled company was stunned into silence by the jester's sudden appearance. They had never seen anyone so bold as to interrupt their proceedings, and they stared at him in disbelief. But then, as if sensing their confusion, Walter began to speak. Pacing the floor of his private chamber as he listened to the escalating clamor from the conclave, desperate for a solution, he decided to call for a massive gathering of church, and it was at this council where the fate of Europe would change forever, and many influential bishops and abbots. Yet amid this assembly of elites, there was one individual who stood out from the rest. A man whose presence seemed almost incongruous among the high-ranking clergy and nobility. In his hands, he carried a staff topped with a wooden ball, and around his neck hung a jingling set of bells. His name was Walter, and he was the official court jester of King Louis VI of France. Walter had been invited to the conclave alongside the king himself, a testament to his unique position at court. He was a member of the royal court, able to offer advice and counsel without fear of reprisal. Still, they paid him no heed and carried on with the proceedings. The importance of Walter's role slowly became apparent. "I have heard enough of this folly," the king said, his voice heavy with fatigue. "These men are acting like children. My lords and gentlemen," he said in a surprisingly resonant voice. When the laughter subsided, Walter continued, "And so it was that the jester led the assembled company in a series of games and contests. In the end, it was the jester who helped them reach a resolution." Walter knew that the call for a crusade would have a profound impact on his beloved France. He saw an opportunity to establish papal authority over the kingdoms of France and England, and to extend the Church as influence into the Holy Land. Adhemar was a master of courtly etiquette, and he knew how to make a good impression. Despite their different approaches to court life, both Walter and Adhemar had the same goal in mind: to make the most of the coming crusade. He knew that the best way to survive in a world of scheming and backstabbing was to stay one step ahead of everyone else. He had learned that beneath the armor and weapons of the knights, beneath the banners and flags of the armies, were simply men. But as the battle raged around him, so let us raise a glass to Walter, the jester. Once upon a time in the waning days of medieval France, there was a famous court jester named Tribult. He was known throughout the land for his quick wit and his daring retorts. So daring, in fact, that one day when Tribult thought he had offended the king, he prepared himself for the executioner's sword. As Renaissance ideas spread and notions of decorum and civility changed, the court jester's outfit was as much a part of their performance as their words or their actions. They serve as a reminder of the power of humor and the importance of being able to laugh at ourselves, even in the darkest of times. And maybe that's the ultimate lesson we can learn from the court jester. Thank you for watching. It was a carefully crafted ensemble designed to make a bold statement and to become an iconic symbol of the jester archetype. Let's break down the key elements of their attire. The most recognizable feature of the court jester's outfit was their hat. It was called a barbet or a brill, and it was a tall, pointed copper or velvet hat that was often decorated with bells or other ornaments. The shape of the hat was designed to make the jester stand out from the crowd, and the bells added a playful touch to their appearance. The jester's clothes were typically made of brightly colored or mismatched fabrics, such as motley, which was a type of rough woolen cloth. The jester's costume was meant to be a riot of color and texture, and it was often deliberately put together in a haphazard or asymmetrical fashion. This contributed to the jester's image as a somewhat unhinged character who is not bound by the same rules or expectations as the rest of the court. The jester's motley clothes were not just a fashion statement, they were a way of marking their status as outsiders. They were not dressed like the king or the courtiers, and this served to emphasize their liminal position at the court. They were neither inside the privileged circle of the nobility nor outside it. They were in a curious in-between space, which allowed them to observe and comment on the goings-on at court in a way that no one else could. The court jester's outfit was completed with a number of accessories, including a staff or a ball. The staff was often used as a prop in the jester's performances, and it could also serve as a symbol of their office. The ball, on the other hand, was a simple spherical object that the jester would toss in the air and catch as they walked. Overall, the court jester's outfit was a carefully considered ensemble that was designed to make a lasting impression. It was an outfit that was as unique and memorable as the jester's wit. Many jesters were actually intellectuals who had studied rhetoric and philosophy. They were expected to be well versed in current affairs and to be able to hold their own in conversation on a wide range of topics. They were able to make people laugh while also making them think. They also had to be physically fit enough to keep up with the demands of the court, which often meant traveling long distances and performing in front of large crowds. This meant wearing the traditional jester outfit of motley clothes and a distinctive hat and carrying a staff or a ball. Court jesters were supposed to be larger-than-life characters who were instantly recognizable. They were the court's clowns, but they were also its philosophers, its satirists, and its critics. They were the ones who could say what everyone else was thinking, but were afraid to voice. In short, they were the ones who kept the king and his court honest. A court jester was the medieval equivalent of a comedian whose job it was to make the king and his courtiers laugh. And while making people laugh was indeed part of the court jester's repertoire, their duties and responsibilities were actually much more varied and complex. A court jester was more than just a clown. They were a member of the royal household who held a unique and somewhat precarious position at the king's court, but also to be a sounding board for the king's thoughts and a foil for his moods. They could be critical and even satirical without being seen as disrespectful, regardless of how powerful they were, including the king. If a jester was not careful, they could easily offend someone important and find themselves out of favor or worse, out of the kingdom. The ribald antics and caustic satire of jesters began to be seen as crude and outmoded. Increasingly, jesters were viewed as relics of a more barbarous age. The growing popularity of professional theater also offered new outlets for wit and satire, but one who existed safely within the confines of fiction. Yet even as the historical figure of the court jester faded, their legacy endured. The jester's distinctive costume with its floppy bell cap and motley colors became an iconic symbol, shorthand for the notion of the wise fool who speaks truth to power. In literature, film, and popular culture, the jester emerged as an archetypal figure, one whose humor and wisdom continue to resonate across the centuries. It illustrates the precarious position of the court jester. Their humor granted them a special license to criticize, but they had to tread a delicate line. One wrong jest could mean the difference between laughter and the executioner's blade. One day, King Francis asked the jester what punishment should be given to a nobleman who had gravely offended the king. They were in the end mere servants, their fate tied to the whims and moods of their royal masters. When times were good, jesters could flourish, but a single misstep or the rise of a new, less tolerant monarch could spell ruin. The very qualities that made a jester successful, wit, boldness, perceptiveness, this is poignantly illustrated in the story of Archibald Armstrong, court jester to King James I and Charles I of England in the early 17th century. Known as Archie Armstrong, he gained fame for his sharp tongue and fearless verses that spared no one, not even the highest members of court and clergy. For a time, Armstrong's satirical jabs made him a favorite of King James, who gave him unusual leeway to mock and criticize. His verses satirizing church officials led to complaints, and he was finally banished from court in 1637 after insulting the Queen and attacking the King's controversial fiscal policies. After a lifetime of royal favor, Armstrong spent his final years in disgrace and poverty. Dying in London around 1672, his fate was a sobering reminder of the jester's dependence on his master's goodwill. The king, taken aback by the harsh suggestion, said that the nobleman was of high birth and should be shown mercy. Well then, Tribble responded, let him choose the tree on which he would prefer to be hanged. In doing so, he demonstrated the deeper function of the court fool as a vital safety valve in the tense world of palace politics, providing a space for humility and self-reflection that was rare in the lofty halls of the court. The decline of Armstrong coincided with a broader shift in attitudes towards jesters in the 17th century. So let's now move on to talk about the relationship between a king and his court jester. What exactly did a court jester do? The court jester may be a thing of the past, but their impact on history and on our culture is still very much alive. Forcefully, for all their stranges and otherness, jesters were not mere caricatures or symbols, but real individuals who struggled like all of us to find meaning and dignity in a world that often denied them both. In their triumphs and tragedies, their laughter and tears, we see a reflection of the human condition in all its absurdity and pathos. In the end, the story of the court jester is a testament to the enduring power of humor and the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the cruelty and indignities they face, jesters managed to create art and meaning in the midst of adversity. They used their wit and imagination to carve out a space for themselves in a society that had no place for them. And in doing so, they left a legacy that continues to inspire and challenge us to this day. So, the next time you hear a joke or laugh at a clever quip, spare a thought for the court. Jesters of old, those brilliant and tragic figures, who dared to speak truth to power and find humor in the darkest of times. In their stories, we may just find a glimmer of our own humanity, a reminder of the laughter and tears that bind us all, and in that shared laughter, perhaps we can find a moment of grace, a fleeting glimpse of the wise fool as eternal wisdom. As we drift off to sleep, let us carry with us the jester spirit of irreverence and resilience. Let us remember that even in the darkest of times, humor and humanity can still shine through, and let us dream of a world where wit and wisdom are valued above power, and privilege where the outsider's voice is heard and celebrated. In that spirit, let us bid good night to the ghosts of jesters, past secure in the knowledge that their laughter echoes still through the ages, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. Sweet dreams, dear listener, and may you find joy and wisdom in the coming day. And with that, my tale is at an end. But before we part ways, I have a question for you. What do you think? What do you think makes a good court jester? Is it their quick wit, their bravery in speaking truth to power, or their ability to find humor in the darkest of times? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And while you re-add it, don't forget to like and subscribe for more historical hijinks. Until next time, farewell, and thanks for listening. Skilled and beloved jester could find himself out of favor and out of a job in an instant. Consider the tale of Geoffrey Hudson, the diminutive jester who served at the court of King Charles I of England. Born to a poor family in Rutlandshire, the young Geoffrey's small stature, who served at the court of King Valdemar II from 1250 to 1286. Like many jesters, Jephthah's origins are shrouded in mystery. We know that he was born around 1235 and that he belonged to a minor noble family, but little else about his early life, or who made too powerful an enemy could find himself out of a job and out of a kingdom in an instant. But it also reminds us of the unique power and appeal of the jester's role. They use humor as a way of critiquing the powerful and holding them to account. They are the modern-day jesters, laughing in the face of authority and reminding us that even in the darkest of times, laughter is the best revenge. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to stay up to date on all our latest content, whose generous support makes it possible for us to bring these videos to a wide audience. But while these modern jesters may not have to worry about being locked up or put to death for their irreverence, they still face their own challenges. They must walk a fine line between being funny and being offensive, between being satirical and being mean-spirited. And they must always be ready to defend their work against accusations of being frivolous or irrelevant. Nevertheless, these modern jesters are an important part of our society. They help us to laugh at ourselves and at the ridiculous situations we find ourselves in. They remind us that even in the face of adversity, laughter is the best revenge. But his legacy lives on in the work of satirists, comedians, and truth-tellers of all stripes. May their wit always be sharp, their timing always perfect, and their laughter always echo in the halls of power. For as long as there has been power, there has been resistance to it, pointing out the absurdity of it all and reminding us that even in the darkest of times, laughter is the best revenge. For what other job allowed its practitioners to be so irreverent, so critical of the powerful, to speak the unspeakable and to hold up a mirror to the follies of mankind? The jester's costume may have been colorful and whimsical, but the truths he espoused were anything but. What we do know comes from the stories that survive about his life at court. While not technically a jester, La Fontaine's work was deeply influenced by the tradition of the court fool. He was born in 1621 in a small village near Paris and received a basic education. But he soon found his true calling in writing fables, short stories that used animals as characters to explore human nature and human folly. A. Fontaine was a master of this form, and his fables quickly became popular throughout France and beyond. They have been translated into dozens of languages and are still read and enjoyed today. But Fontaine's work was not without its critics. Some of his fables were seen as too satirical, too critical of the French nobility and clergy. He continued to write, and his later fables are some of his best and most incisive work. He helped to keep the tradition of the court fool alive long after the days of the medieval monarchy were over, which offer a fascinating glimpse into the world of medieval courtly entertainment. Jephthah was known as a master of many arts, including music, poetry, and acrobatics. He was also a skilled hunter and swordsman, but it was his wit and his irreverence that made him truly unforgettable. He was known for his sharp tongue and his willingness to speak his mind, and he was particularly fond of ridiculing the pomposity and hypocrisy of the church. Jeff threw a handful of nuts into the pulpit and shouted, "Lest while you're talking about lust, you forget to cast your eyes downwards." He was a master of the retort, able to turn any insult or barb aimed at him into a fresh jest. He was known for his generosity to the poor and his willingness to stick up for the downtrodden. He was particularly fond of children and animals, and he was said to have a special talent for communicating with birds. Despite his fame, however, Jephthah was not without his enemies. The conservative elements of the court hated his mockery of their traditions and his criticism of the clergy. Jephthah walked by and shouted. The queen was furious and demanded that Jephthah be fired from the royal court. Jephthah's time at court was running out. According to legend, Jephthah spent his final years traveling around Europe, brought him to the attention of the Duchess of Buckingham, who took him into her household as a human pet. In 1626, the Duchess presented Geoffrey to the king and queen at a grand banquet where he was famously served to the royals in a large pie. The queen was so delighted by the tiny jester that she took him into her own service. And for a time, Geoffrey enjoyed all the privileges and favors of a royal favorite. As political tensions mounted between the king and parliament, Geoffrey was captured by parliamentary forces and imprisoned for his loyalty to the crown. He withdrew from public life and died in obscurity in 1682, his once bright star long since faded. But it was far from unique among the annals of court jesters. The life of a fool, for all its glitter and glamour, was a hard one. Even those jesters who managed to avoid the worst fates often grappled with their own inner demons. The ability to see through the pretenses of the powerful could also be a source of great pain and alienation. Many jesters came from difficult backgrounds. They were often individuals who had been marginalized by society due to their physical appearance. The role of the jester offered a rare chance at social acceptance and even a measure of fame and fortune. But it came at a cost. This tension between acceptance and alienation was perhaps best captured by one of history's most famous jesters, the Danish nobleman Jeppe Håkonsen. The story of Joff Håkonsen reminds us that the life of a jester was a precarious one. The jester who pushed the limits of acceptability too far. Jean de La Fontaine's story is a reminder that the spirit of the jester can live on in unexpected places. Today, the role of the jester is often taken on by comedians, satirists, and social commentators. Thank you for watching this episode. And yet, for all the dangers and indignities of the jester's life, in a world defined by rigid hierarchies and unyielding codes of behavior, he wanted to be a player in the game of power. They thought he was a troublemaker, and they weren't sorry to see him go. But the common people loved him. He was free, and he was able to make people laugh. That was all that mattered to him. Like Will Sommers, de La Fontaine started his career as a court jester. Throughout history, jesters have been persecuted, imprisoned, and killed for speaking out against the powerful. He began to criticize the king and the nobility, and he was eventually banished from the court. They're not supposed to get involved in politics. But the truth is that jesters are more than just entertainers. They're social commentators. They're free to speak out because they have nothing to lose. And so we should listen to jesters. He died believing that he had done the right thing. And so should we. We should pay attention to their message because they have something important to tell us. Well, first of all, Will's story reminds us that jesters are more than just entertainers. They're social commentators. They're truth tellers. They're often silenced because the powerful don't want to hear the truth, but that shouldn't stop us from speaking out. We should continue to speak the uncomfortable truths, even if we risk being silenced ourselves, because in the end, it's the truth that matters. They've always been outsiders, and this gives them a unique perspective on the world. They see the suffering of the poor and the powerless, and they feel compelled to speak out. He became known as the scourge of the nobility, and he was one of the most successful writers of his time. But as the years passed, Will got older and his health started to decline. He was a jester at the court of Francis I, and he was known for his wit and his intelligence. He wasn't afraid to speak his mind, and he often criticized the king and the nobles. This made him unpopular at court, but he was beloved by the common people. He was eventually accused of heresy, and he was burned at the stake. He developed a drinking problem, and he became increasingly bitter. He missed his life at court, and he resented the king for kicking him out. In the end, he died believing that he was the rightful heir to the throne. And as he lay on his deathbed, he cursed the Tudors and their descendants. They saw him as a champion of the downtrodden, a voice for the voiceless. And when Will hit the road, he had plenty of supporters. He was a jester, yes, but he was also a poet, a songwriter, and a political activist. He used his wit and his charm to challenge the establishment, and he paid the price for it. But he wasn't the only one. There were other jesters throughout history who dared to speak out, and they, too, faced the wrath of the authorities. They laughed at his jokes and cheered at his defiance of the king. Will basked in the adulation of the people. He knew that he couldn't challenge the king directly, but he could fight back in his own way. He wrote songs and poems that mocked the nobility and the clergy. He lampooned the courtiers and the counselors, and he made fun of the king's favorite wife. Anne of Cleves, his fourth wife, didn't like Will's sense of humor. When she heard him singing one of his new songs, she demanded that he be arrested. She knew that Will was a threat to her position, and she wasn't going to take any chances. But Will was too popular to lock up. The common people rioted when they heard that he'd been arrested, and Anne had to release him if she didn't want to start a full-blown rebellion. He was loyal to Henry, and he genuinely believed that he was helping to steer the kingdom in the right direction. He saw Will's intelligence and his charm, and he feared that if Will got too powerful, he might turn against him. So when Will started to criticize the king's policies, He was out of the court in no time. Whatever the reason, Will's fall from grace was a reminder of the precariousness of the jester's position. No matter how beloved or influential he might be, the fool was always at the mercy of his master's whims. And in a world where power was absolute and unaccountable, even the most clever and courageous jester could find himself out in the cold. A figure who could upset the established order, who could speak the unspeakable and imagine the unimaginable. In this sense, the jester can be seen as a kind of trickster figure, a mischievous sprite who delights in overturning the normal rules of society. He is the lord of misrule, the master of the carnivalesque, the one who, for a brief shining moment, can make the world stand on its head and reveal the absurdity and arbitrariness of the social order. Will Sommers, one of Henry VIII's 8 children, died believing that he was the rightful heir to the throne. He came as close as anyone to toppling his sister Mary and establishing a Protestant dynasty. If only his father had listened to him instead of doctors, Will had the strongest claim to the throne. He was born first, before Mary, although she beat him to the punch by 3 minutes, not that it mattered. His sister was the child of a previous marriage, and Henry wanted someone of his own to carry on the Tudor dynasty. As soon as Will was old enough, he went to live with his father. He was brought up in the royal court, and by the time he was 7, he was performing as a jester. It was a good gig. He got to hang around the royal court, pull pranks on the courtiers, and even get into scrapes with the king's counselors. But for Will, it wasn't just a job. He was serious about it. He loved the court. He loved the pomp and ceremony, the pageantry, and the power. But above all, he loved his father, and he wanted nothing more than to make him happy. He tried his best to be the perfect son, to excel in his duties as a jester, and to win the king's favor. But Henry was a volatile monarch. One minute he would be roaring with laughter at Will's jokes. The next he would be furious at his insolence. Will was never sure what would set his father off, but he learned to tread carefully. He knew that the king's favor was fickle and that he could be banished or beheaded on a whim. As Will got older, he became more ambitious. He wanted more than just to be a jester. In 1545, Will was banished from court for reasons that remain unclear. Some say he spoke out too forcefully against the king's policies. The king's counselors were not fans of Will's. For the rest of his life, Will traveled the country, entertaining the people and making enemies of the powerful. Will Sommers is a fascinating historical figure. One of the most famous jesters in history was Jean de La Fontaine, who lived in France during the reign of King Louis XIV. Another famous French jester was Triboulet, who lived in the 16th century. These are just 2 examples of jesters who challenged the status quo and who paid the ultimate price for it. But there are many others. But why? Why do jesters have this urge to defy the establishment? After all, they're supposed to be entertainers. It's easy to be complicit when you're part of the system, but jesters are not part of the system. They're outsiders. And that brings us back to Will Sommers. Why do we remember Will Sommers today? Will Sommers' life was a tragedy, but his story is also an inspiration. In the whimsical realm of Arthurian legend, King Arthur's court was graced by the presence of one such jester, Sir Adam de Carlin, and noble families across Europe eagerly sought to secure the services of traveling entertainers to grace their courts with their presence. The literary world has long been enamored with the jester, the tricksy, quick-witted companion to the hero who dances on the edge of danger. Summoning what little strength he had left, the truth-teller who paid the price, a life that, like the jester's own, is full of both tragedy and triumph. Around him, the courtiers watched in fascination and fear, forgetting the punchlines to his practice jokes. Leaving him alone in a crowded hall, The courtiers understood that the greatest jester of them all had completed his eternal performance and joined the cosmic jest, leaving behind a legacy of laughter that echoed through the ages. For every jester who fades into the darkness, a new one arises to take their place. The tradition continues as young performers don the motley and step into the ring of fire between laughter and sorrow, between truth and power. To keep on speaking our truth, to keep on dreaming of something better, each new monarch demanding a fresh coat of paint and a new melody to dance to. The jester adapted, adjusting his bells and tightening his garish clothes, trying to recapture the vigor of his youth, reminding us that the world is never as it seems and that laughter is the best revenge. While Robin Hood captures the hearts of the masses with his daring exploits and noble intentions, each twist bringing new faces to the feast, but never quite the same merry company. Through it all, he remained a steadfast presence. He saw queens fade from beauty, but through it all, he kept on jesting, finding humor in the inevitability of it all, using his booming laughter and folksy wisdom to lighten the mood and inspire camaraderie among his fellow outlaws, reminding us that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can endure. From the sunny disposition of Shakespeare's Touchstone to the mischievous spirit of Robin Hood's Little John, who have enriched our lives with their infectious laughter and unwavering optimism. May their memory live on in the hearts and minds of all who cherish the power of humor to heal, to inspire, and to unite us all. Literature is filled with memorable jesters who use wit and whimsy to navigate the complexities of human relationships and the challenges of everyday life. These characters, though seemingly simple and carefree, offer profound insights into the human condition, reminding us that laughter is often the best medicine and that a good sense of humor can be a valuable tool in times of trouble. The jester archetype finds its American counterpart in the irrepressible figure of Jim. Like a medieval jester, Jim uses humor to mask his pain and sorrow, finding solace in laughter as he confronts the harsh realities of slavery and racism in the antebellum South, guiding Huck toward a deeper understanding of humanity and compassion. In the grand halls of medieval castles, the jester became a fixture, and so the jester as legacy lives on in the pages of our favorite stories and the traditions of our most cherished festivals. Jesters have used costumes, music, and dance to bring joy and merriment to celebrations of all kinds. The jester's influence can even be seen in the world of politics, where the art of political satire has long relied on the power of laughter to skewer hypocrisy and challenge authority. Thinkers like Voltaire and Thomas Paine used wit and wordplay to expose the folly of oppressive regimes and inspire calls for reform and revolution. By donning the mantle of the jester, they navigated the treacherous waters of censorship and persecution, ensuring that the message of liberty and equality would resonate with audiences across the globe. For while the jester may be mocked and ridiculed by those in power, in the iconic tale of Robin Hood, Little John embodies the archetypal jester. And let us not forget the unforgettable jesters of our own time. As the years rolled by, the jester witnessed the rise and fall of countless courtiers. Then, one fateful night, as the flames flickered low in the great hearth and the shadows deepened in the corners of the hall. But the story of the jester doesn't end there. A smattering of applause broke out around the room as the fool removed the final plank and stepped triumphantly onto the tightrope stretched between the two castle towers. Below him, the drawbridge had been lowered to form, a makeshift stage for the jester's daring feat, each movement precise and controlled as he made his way slowly towards the far side of the chasm. Suddenly, the fool stumbled, recovering quickly, The kingdom mourned the loss of its beloved jester. His death sent shockwaves throughout the land, the jester forever silenced, his laughter echoing through the ages. Where once he had danced, now only memories remained, the weight of his kingdom pressing down upon him like a suffocating shroud. Unable to bear the suffocating silence, he called for his advisors to begin the search for a replacement. Startled, he turned to see a small figure standing in the doorway. It was a young girl, no older than 10, dressed in rags, her eyes wide and hopeful. The queen and her daughter, their faces pale and etched with worry, cutting through the layers of pretense and deceit that had become so commonplace in the court. As she mocked the noble's vanity and foibles, his sides aching with mirth, the king found himself laughing for the first time since the jester's death. He knew that beneath the jester's colorful garments and bells lay a noble soul who had dared to speak truth to power in the face of adversity, some resenting her audacious jests at their expense. However, the king's amusement was all that mattered, a reminder of the man who had taught him that sometimes the greatest courage lies in laughter. The kingdom rejoiced, their beloved jester brought back to life through Alar's antics, one who could match wit for wit and jest for jest. Believing that without the jester's presence to lighten the oppressive mood, the kingdom's woes would only grow. But how could he replace the irreplaceable? And until next time, may your laughter echo through the halls of your own adventures, chasing away the lingering gloom of her predecessor's demise. The king pondered, knowing that no other jester could hope to match the quick wit and charm of his predecessor. Days bled into weeks, the king's despair deepening with each passing hour. Instead, heated arguments and bitter rivalries now filled the halls. Without the jester's light-hearted banter, the court felt heavy and lifeless, silencing him permanently and eliminating a constant thorn in her side. She juggled, danced, and recited poetry, each trick more impressive than the last. But it was her sharp tongue and quick wit that truly captivated the king. The king regarded the girl skeptically, wondering if she was serious. But something in her voice, a hint of defiance and wit, piqued his interest. Now, as the funeral procession dispersed and the town slowly stirred back to life, the queen and her daughter slipped away unnoticed, their guilt a heavy cloak upon their shoulders, while the rest of the kingdom mourned the loss of their beloved jester. They knew the true cause of his untimely demise lay not in a tragic accident, but in the queen's own malevolent schemes, leaving an indelible mark on the hearts of all who had known him. Finally, with one last surge of strength, he reached the platform on the opposite tower, collapsing onto his knees in a dramatic display of exhaustion. Steadying himself, he pressed on, his eyes fixed intently on the path ahead. With each step, the fool teetered precariously, his body swaying dangerously close to the edge. Onlookers leaned forward, holding their breath as he fought to stay upright. The vibrant tapestries and gilding now muted and dusty in the dim torchlight. Their faces, usually animated with song and laughter, were drawn and grim. Onlookers watched, mesmerized, as the jester struggled to maintain his balance. The fool lay motionless on the ground, his broken body a stark silhouette against the gaping void. All went silent, save for the steady drip of blood from the fallen jester. The fool raised his head, revealing a face streaked with sweat and dirt, his exaggerated white makeup smeared beyond recognition. With a weary smile, he doffed his tattered hat to the crowd, then slowly began the long walk back across the tightrope. The cheers grew louder still as he reached the center of the rope, their volume echoing the increasing peril of his journey. Then, as he neared the end of his tightrope walk, disaster struck, and just as suddenly, the world lurched back into motion as the crowd erupted into chaos, their screams swallowed by the yawning depths below. At the cemetery, a hush fell over the crowd as the coffin was lowered into the grave. As the final shovel loads of dirt were tossed onto the grave, But amidst the sea of sorrow, a small group of figures stood apart. They had succeeded in silencing the jester, but the echoes of his laughter continued to reverberate through the halls of the castle, haunting their every waking moment. Back within the grand hall, days had turned into weeks, for the joy that once filled these hallowed halls had been extinguished with the jester's passing. Each day he awoke to the haunting echo of the jester's laughter, a cruel mockery of his present sorrow. Yet the need for laughter and levity in the court was crucial, and so the search continued. The king missed the jester's uncanny ability to diffuse tense situations with a well-timed jest. One evening, as the king sat alone in his chambers, lost in thought, a knock echoed through the quiet room. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, clutching a worn leather bag. She bowed her head slightly and said, with a wave of his hand, he gestured for her to continue. And so the young girl, whose name was Alara, began to perform. Her jests were not merely clever, they were incisive. In time, the memory of the original jester faded, replaced by the new jester's sharp wit and irreverent humor. But the king never forgot the profound impact his former jester had made on him and the kingdom. And so, in the quiet of his chambers, the king kept a portrait of the jester. If you enjoyed this whimsical tale of laughter, magic, and resilience, I invite you to explore more stories like it. Thank you for joining me today.